Welcome to another installment of our First World War review for the IB History exam. I'm here today with a special guest lecturer. His name is Jack, and he wants to tell everybody hello out there.
Hi.
All right, now he's going to go back and bounce on a trampoline for a little while. Um, Today we're going to talk about American involvement in the First World War, and it's appropriate today as it just so happens that today is the 99th anniversary of the United States declaration of war against Germany in the First World War. In 1917, on April 7th, the United States officially declared war. But this was a great change from where America started the war. Originally, the United States proclaimed neutrality in the First World War. In 1914, American President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed this neutrality and that the American populace supported this idea. In fact, when Wilson would run for president in 1916, he would run on a re-election campaign slogan of, quote, "He kept us out of war." While we were not involved in the European War, we were certainly active in foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, with Woodrow Wilson continuing some policies of his predecessors and taking a more assertive role in Latin American diplomacy. The United States did use the European War, however, as an economic opportunity. We were trying to take over European markets and increasing trade with both sides of the war. But as the war grew, trade would be impeded by the naval blockades put on by the British and by German U-boat attacks. These German U-boats threatened lives and goods traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. British mines did much of the same. So as the war pressed on, despite the United States being neutral, the Americans began to trade far more with the British and the French during the course of the war, and not the Germans. Not as much to the Germans because of that British blockade. We just couldn't get aid or trade into the German state. On May 6, 1915, there's a seminal event in the history of World War I, but one that gets a little overplayed in terms of America getting involved. The sinking of the passenger liner, the Lusitania, in which over 100 U.S. citizens were killed. Germany, following this, was pressured to cease their use of what is known as unrestricted submarine warfare, and we'll talk about this more in a later video. But they would, in fact, continue following the sinking of the Lusitania. But this became a black eye in the propaganda war against Germany, and it started to push some Americans, especially in light of 100 American citizens being killed on this ship, started to push some Americans on the side of the British and the French in World War I. In the following year, we've got the torpedoing of another passenger liner called the SS Sussex. This is also going to be condemned by the international community, in particular the United States. And the United States and their diplomatic relations with Germany will be greatly harmed by the sinking of the Sussex. Following this sinking, Germany issued what is known as the Sussex Pledge, a promise, a threefold promise that one, passenger ships would not be sunk, that two, merchant ships would only be sunk when they had arms aboard them, and finally, three, the lives of the crew aboard merchant ships would be accounted for. So this is the German Sussex Pledge, and it is purely meant in hopes of keeping the United States from breaking off diplomatic relations with Germany or even possibly joining the war effort. In 1917, however, the Germans feel that unrestricted submarine warfare, while it might bring the Americans into the fight, could actually lead to the fastest end to the First World War for the Germans. So they will resume their unrestricted submarine warfare. And this resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the violation of the Sussex Pledge will be one cause that begins to push the United States towards joining the war. Another factor in the United States joining the war is the Zimmermann telegram. Now, here is a copy of the Undeciphered Zimmermann telegram. This is a German telegram sent from Germany to their Mexican ambassador, offering an alliance between Germany and Mexico in order for Mexico to recover the territory that they lost in the Mexican War in the 19th century. This telegram was intercepted by British intelligence and deciphered and handed over to the Americans. This would dramatically push American public sentiment against the Germans, and ultimately by April of 1917, as we've already mentioned, on April 7th, 1917, the United States will declare war on the nation of Germany. The resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram are offered as two causes for the war. Now, initially, American entry into the war has little impact. Once our resources and manpower become available, though, the balance will be tipped towards the Allies on the Western Front. This is also very timely because in 1917, this is also the year of the Russian revolutions. By April of 1917, Russia's got their provisional government under Alexander Kerensky. However, they stay in the war, but that will come to an end in the end of 1917 with the second Russian Revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the new Russian leadership pushes to get Russia out of the war. Another factor that the United States has to deal with in joining the war is the reality that our army was quite small in 1917. We can take a look at this small graph provided by the United States Army itself. In April of 1917, the American army was quite limited. Under 400,000 troops when the war was declared, and many of those were National Guardsmen. Conscription is introduced in May of 1917, and by November of 1918, the Americans have almost 5 million men in uniformed service. But this training and the transport of these soldiers across the Atlantic is going to take some time, and it won't be until early 1918 that the United States begins to put the first boots on the ground, and really Americans don't start seeing real combat in the First World War until the spring of 1918. Ultimately, this added manpower and access to American resources in the war will turn the tide of the battle, especially at a time when the Russians will be backing out of the war and Germany can put the full force of their army on the Western Front. So while in and of itself the American aid was definitely late to come, it came at a crucial time for the Allies. Now I want to go back and mention one quick note about the early years of the war when the United States was willing to sell to both sides of the army, both sides of the war. And I want you to recall when we talked about the 1930s and Franklin Roosevelt and the United States neutrality as the Second World War became a possibility. If you recall, the United States Senate commissioned a committee to investigate the reasons why the United States got into war. This was called the Nye Committee. And what the Nye Commission ultimately reported on was that a major factor in getting the United States involved in the war was the fact that the Americans were selling arms, certainly to both sides, but as the war pressed on, due to the British blockade and due to German U-boats, the Americans were able to get far more goods and trade far more with the British and the French. And according to the Nye Commission in the 1930s, this would give the United States, even though we were technically neutral at the time, a vested interest in seeing the British and the French win this First World War. So keep that in the back of your mind, kind of combine our discussions about neutrality leading up to the Second World War with now what we know about the First World War. And with that said, we're gonna tune out, and I will say goodbye to you until tomorrow, and Jack will probably say goodbye as well.
Bye.
There he goes. All right, and we will tune in tomorrow.